Hello, thank you for joining our book walkthrough on strategic nuclear targeting. My name is Nelson Chow, and I'll be going through each chapter of this book about nuclear targeting in the upcoming weeks with you. Week 1. About this book, the editors, and preface. This book was published in 1986 during the Peace War. It contains 14 essays about strategic nuclear targeting. So this book is nearly 40 years old, and from a 2022 perspective, there's certainly a lot of things that sounded borderline insane to us. This is actually my copy. It was originally from the Fulton Montgomery Community College Library. It was first lended out in December 1994 and then last lended out in 1995, January. So nearly no one read it. This is part of the Cornell Studies in Security Affairs series, and this Cornell Studies in Security Affairs is still being maintained, and there are a lot of interesting publications under these collections. So, what is this book about? The editors of this book thought the public at the time had very little understanding about the actual nuclear war plan of the US, its allies, and the Soviet Union. Specifically, what are the targets? What about timing? What about intended effect? To a large extent, the public today may still have a very vague idea of how a nuclear war may be fought. A lot of times we hear, oh, nuclear war, it's doomsday weapon and the world will be destroyed. Of course, that's not true. You don't press the button with the intention to destroy the world. You employ the weapon to respond to a situation, or you try to achieve an intent. And you should always have war termination in your mind. Now, this book also focuses on nuclear war planning and the development of the SIOP. The SIOP stands for the Single Integrated Operational Plan, and it was the US General Plan for Nuclear War between 1961 to 2003, and then it was incorporated into the O Plan, or the Operations Plan under the Strategic Deterrence after 2003. And then this book dedicated some chapters on the targeting policies of the French, of the Brits, and the Soviets, all the major players in the 1980s. And finally, the book talks about what types of targeting the population, targeting military assets, targeting the political centers, and even stopping your opponent from recovering economically. And then finally, war termination again. So how do you stop a nuclear war once it's started? This book is a collection of 14 essays, so we don't actually have a typical author here per se, but we do have two editors. Editor 1, Professor Desmond Ball, or Des Ball. He attended ANU, the Australian National University, in 1965. He wrote over 60 books and monographs, and he is most famous for US defense planning during the Cold War era. Interestingly, Des Ball was actually a person of interest by the ASIO, or the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, think the Australian CIA, following him reviewing the development of the Pine Gap surveillance facility in Alice Springs, Australia in 1966. What is Pine Gap? Pine Gap is a satellite ground station partly run by the CIA, the NSA, the NRO in the Australian soil. So for those of you interested in Pine Gap, there's actually a 2018 TV show about it. Des Ball is unsurprisingly a political realist. What is a realist? A realist believes the world politics is always and necessarily a field of conflict in pursuit of interest. It is important to note that although he's a realist, Professor Ball actually advised Jimmy Carter, the US president, against nuclear strikes of the Soviet targets. And he was described by Carter as the man who saved the world. Very qualified. He was appointed an officer of the Order of Australia, aka AO, in 2014, and each year only about 100 to 140 Australian will receive such an honor. So very distinguished scholar, this Desmond Ball. Editor number 2, we have Jeffrey T. Richardson. Richardson was known for his work on the intelligence community and espionage. To give you an appreciation of Richardson, some of his books include The U.S. Intelligence Community, 1985, Sword and Shields, The Soviet Intelligence and Security Apparatus, 1985. Also, with Desmond Ball, The Ties That Bind, Intelligence Cooperation Between the UK-US Countries, 1985. America's Secret Eye in Space, 1990. America's Space Sentinel, DSP Satellite and National Security, 1999. What is a DSP satellite? DSP stands for Defense Support Programs. They are satellites that fly in the geosynchronous orbit that look for infrared and background that detects missile launches, space launches, or detonation. So infrared eyes in the sky, if you will. As you can see, Richardson was very involved in the US intelligence community, and he was actually also notable for his relentless freedom of information request to further the scholarship in the intelligence and espionage area. But at one point, he was avoided by the US intelligence community as an outsider, and he was thought as a security risk at one point. And now we move to the preface. The central theme of the book is that targeting should be central to nuclear strategy. Specifically, what things should targeteers be aiming, and why something is chosen to be the target instead of something else. Remember, a warhead is not only terrifyingly powerful, but they are also expensive and hard to produce. Once you used it, they are not immediately replaceable, especially in the context of a war. Hence, planning and weapon allocation are very important, and how these plans and allocation align to national priorities. For those of you who are interested, look up the letter of last resort, and these are handwritten letters written by the UK Prime Ministers to the CEO of the 4 SSBNs that the Brit has. The logic is that the letter contains what action to take if a nuclear strike has destroyed the British government, and what should these subs do. Generally 4 things: they could retaliate, they could not retaliate, or they could put themselves into command of an ally force such as US or Australia if they exist. And the 4th one is my favorite. It says, use your own judgment. And these 4 identical handwritten letters, if we ever get to see it, would perfectly summarize the targeting theme of this book. What to target, what's your rationale, how many weapons to allocate per target. But of course, these letters are replaced and destroyed every time a new PM comes into power, so we may never. Anyway, the preface argues that instead of what to target and weapon allocations, the public debates tend to be too focused on the philosophies and doctrine. It is too high a level of a discussion. Or they're focusing on weapon acquisition, hardware, numbers, the sexy technical things. And it was in the 70s that we finally realized that yes, philosophy is important. Yes, weapons are cool. Don't stop talking about that. But we do need to talk about targeting. How did we realize that? It was by examining declassified targeting documents of the 40s and 50s. We have these fantastically powerful weapons, and our targeting was irrational and arbitrary. Luckily, they're amassing nuclear weapons. Question mark. Strategic objective achieved kind of works because strategic objective of a nuke is deterrence, right? So ultra powerful punches punches arbitrarily can still work in preventing people punching at you. That kind of works. But what if deterrence fail? Or what if strategic objective of such a weapon is no longer deterrence? It is at some point someone want to actually use these weapons in the theater against the conventional forces. What if instead of massive retaliation, a president wanted more flexibility in employing nuclear weapons? And here comes PD-59. PD is a presidential directive. Think of it as an executive order, but classified. Jimmy Carter inherited a nuclear strike plan from the previous administration, and it was thought to be too inflexible, too massive, and the president wanted more flexibility in employing the nuclear weapons. Now, Jimmy Carter is not the first administration who complained about the inflexibility of nuclear weapons. For those of you who watched Errol Morris / Robert McNamara's Fog of War, you would have recalled that Kennedy also protested about the inflexibility of nuclear weapons. With PD-59 signed in 1980, you get to have a limited weapon employment policy. It actually considered the deterrence fail scenario. When deterrence fails, your targeting logic and weapon allocation are no longer there for show. It cannot be shoddy, it cannot be irrational. So is this PD-59 good or not? Smaller scale, nuclear employment on one hand, but on the other hand, the main controversies of the PD-59 is that the public thinks that it essentially lowered the threshold of employing nuclear weapon. So with PD-59, people think that the president is more likely to use a nuclear weapon. PD-59 was declassified in 2012, a decade ago, so you can go read it with 2020 hindsight. PD-59 also has a technical component in it that they think that by using high-tech intelligence that they can target field conventional forces without risking escalation. Speaking of optimism there, the drafter of PD-59 thought that the Soviet Union thinks that they can have a winnable nuclear war, so they drafted PD-59, but obviously with a lot of post-Cold War interview examining their documents, no Soviet policymakers back then, no serious ones, think that they can actually win a nuclear war. Man, if we can read minds. So that concludes the preface of the book. Over the next days or weeks, we will go through each of these chapters in the following order. In the next video, we will go over an introductory essay by Professor Desmond Ball, Toward a Critique of Strategic Nuclear Targeting. Speak with you all soon.